In a world that has been severely hit by the pandemic, where public and private resources need to be used wisely, some may worry that the economic recovery and productivity growth may be incompatible with climate goals. So how can we make sure that net zero does not mean zero growth? Innovation may be the answer. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink said that the next 1,000 unicorns, meaning private startups with a market value over $1 billion US, won't be search engines or social media companies. They'll be sustainable, scalable innovators, startups that help the world decarbonize and make the transition, the energy transition, affordable for all consumers. And that's going to require a large amount of investment, a large amount of ingenuity, and a large amount of innovation. Amongst other policies, breakthrough technologies are going to be crucial in a number of key sectors of the economy, such as energy, transport, and construction. Innovations around renewables, industrial and car batteries, low carbon cement, and carbon capture will not only need to be further developed, but also scaled up and disseminated widely so that they become viable alternatives to less green options. Think about electric vehicles. The first electric car was introduced in 1890 by a chemist from Iowa. Its top speed was an impressive 14 miles per hour. What not many people know, however, is that by 1900, the electric car had become quite popular in the US. About 30% of all vehicles were electric. Ferdinand Porsche, Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford all worked to perfect it. But the success of these cars came to a stop with the discovery of oil reserves in Texas and elsewhere, and as oil became cheaper and more widely available. The quick development of combustion engines further stalled demand for electric cars. And it was only with the oil crisis of 1973 and the US Energy Department's huge investments in research on batteries and other technologies that the hype around electric cars reignited. But with their limited range and speed, these cars were not competitive yet. What was missing was a path of innovation. We know that competitive markets can act as a driver of innovation, and in particular green innovation, but they may not work alone. First, as consumers, we cannot choose what is not on the menu. So when a more polluting technology already exists in a market, it may be very difficult for a new clean technology to establish itself as a viable alternative. Second, greener products often are more expensive. The green technology needs to play catch up with the level of development of the more polluting technology. And when the gap is large, research efforts and investment may not be directed towards the clean technology, further perpetuating this gap. And third, there may also be information asymmetries and behavioral biases hampering consumers' demand for greener products. In our electric car example, that market only became more competitive after the 90s, with increased concerns about climate change and with the big Japanese manufacturers and a small startup from Silicon Valley entering the market and growing to become one of the world's most valuable car companies. And today, global sales of electric vehicles are expected to reach 30% by 2030. That is the market shares of the beginning of the industry, but having had about 100 years of technology gap to catch up on. This story tells us that sometimes timely and well-targeted state measures may be needed to steer investments towards green innovation. They can help kickstart a virtuous circle of innovation aimed at bringing these technologies to the market and lowering their costs to make them affordable. And this story also teaches us that once a technology has been established, it is open and competitive markets that sustain the virtuous circle of innovation in the medium to long term. They ensure that resources are allocated efficiently, that companies can differentiate themselves from their rivals, and that consumers are offered a wider choice of greener products at lower prices. So how exactly can competition policy best support green innovation? Here at the OECD, we have done a lot of work on sustainability and competition in the last 2 years, and also explored in a recent report how competition enforcement can help prevent anti-competitive conduct and mergers that also harm green innovation. A number of questions, however, remain open as regards the role of competition policy more broadly. What is the importance of innovation and competitive markets for the green transition? And how can public and private resources be best used to promote green technology? What is the role of competition policy in fostering green innovation? Is it a catalyst, or it can at times also act as an obstacle? And does competition policy need to adapt, or it is already fit for purpose to help the green transition? We will use today's session to explore these questions with our excellent speakers. And we will start with Philippe Aghion, economist and professor at Collège de France, INSEAD, and the London School of Economics. His studies and research literally shaped the economic thinking on innovation. We will then have Lluís Romero, who is head of unit of the chief economist team of the European Commission, and previously worked as a consultant at Charles River Associates in London and as an economic advisor at the UK Competition Commission. Thomas Cheng is associate professor at the University of Hong Kong and just published a monograph on the patent competition interface in developing countries. And finally, we have Diane Coyle, economist and professor of public policy at the University of Cambridge. Among many public services and service roles, Professor Coyle was a member of the UK Competition Commission and part of the Digital Competition Expert Panel that issued the Unlocking Digital Markets report. She also published a new book with the title Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be. I will start with a few questions to our speakers to help frame the discussion. To those connected, please send us your comments and any question you have for our guests in the chat box on your screen. So first, Professor Aghion, your last book, The Power of Creative Destruction, includes a discussion on the interplay between green innovation and sustainable growth. Some may see competition policy as being somewhat at odds with environmental protection because it aims at increasing output and lowering prices. You also note in your book, and I quote, that in an economy where consumers are more concerned with the price of goods than they are with their environmental impact, increased competition will not stimulate green innovation and will instead aggravate the environmental problem. What is your view of the relationship between competition policy and green innovation? Is this policy a driver of green innovation, and when is that the case?
Thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks, Cristina. Thanks for all the very interesting opening interventions and your very good introduction. And it's great, wonderful to be with Diane and with Thomas and with Lluís. In fact, the first element. So we know to fight climate change, negative growth is not the solution. We went through negative growth during the first lockdown. In France, between March and June 2020, GDP went down by 35% and CO2 emissions by 8%. But we know all the collateral damages that were caused by the lockdown. We had to go through the lockdowns, but we don't want to be permanently in the equivalent of the first lockdown. So we know the only alternative to that is green innovation. And the problem is that innovation is not spontaneously green. And so the work that I've been doing with, particularly with John Van Reenen and Ralph Martin and Antoine de Chez-le-Prêtre and David Emus, and shows that, and we looked at the car industry, that firms that innovated in the past in dirty technologies, they tend to continue to innovate in dirty technologies. You tend to continue doing what you are good at. We call that path dependence in the direction of innovation. So that has a first implication. The first implication is that creative destruction will help you because of course new entrants do not face this path dependence problem. You see, there is no yesterday for them. So you want to favor creative destruction there, because the new entrants do not face the problem that you face with incumbents. The incumbents tend to stick to their bad habits. Entrants don't have any bad habits. So that's the first thing. So entry is already there. You can see that fostering entry and creative destruction in itself, it's good for green. You see what I mean? Because it's one way to circumvent the path dependence problem. So that's already one aspect very important of competition and green. But there is another aspect, which is the competition policy. As you would you like to have more competitive markets? You know, better enforcement, better regulation of merger and acquisition, breakup of firms, whatever, to have more active competition policy. Alors, competition has two counteracting effects on CO2 emissions, as you exactly put it right. One thing is a scale effect. It's true that in a sense, to the extent that competition leads to lower prices and more consumption, that tends to increase pollution, because that's kind of the static effect of competition. Is that more competition means that you have a bigger market size, more consumers, bigger size of production. That in itself can be detrimental to the environment. We call that the Chinese effect. You see what I mean? Well, that's one effect. But on the other hand, the good side of competition policy and competition is that more competition induces innovation to escape competition. That's why competition is good for innovation. The question is, will it induce the right type of innovation? And that's where consumer social value matter. If you are in a country where consumers do not care much about the environment, competition can go either way. It will foster innovation, but you have no guarantee that it will foster green innovation. On the other hand, if you are in an economic environment where consumers care about the environment, there competition will foster green innovation. Because suppose Diane and I are innovating. Diane is virtuous and I'm not virtuous. If I am alone, if I'm the monopoly, I don't care that much. Okay, consumers may want, green, but anyway, they have no choice but purchasing from me. And I won't bother much to innovate green. But now Diane comes in and she's virtuous. If I don't do the right thing, I lose my clients to Diane. I lose my customers to Diane. And there, even if I am not virtuous in the first place, I have no choice but innovating green to sustain the competition with Diane. And this interaction between social values, but that only works in a place where, of course, consumers care about the environment. But the combination of social values and competition, this is a very strong instrument. We show in this recent work with Roland Benabou and Ralph Martin and Alexandra Roulet that this is equivalent to 3 times the increase in carbon price that led to the Yellow Vest movement in France. So it's a very strong, it's a very powerful tool. If you are in an environment where people, alors now the question is, how can you enhance social values? And of course, one thing is that, if you experience a catastrophe, of course it will affect social values. I bet you that in Germany, in Rhénanie, after the last summer, or in New York with the floodings, that contributes, of course, to awareness, consumers' awareness about the importance of it. But I believe also in education policy. But you can see to also, and media, and but anything that can foster the values combined with competition, it's a very powerful force to enhance, to make innovation greener. And I don't want to be too long because you said you would not be too. So you see the two things: creative destruction in itself and competition policy, provided you are in an environment where social values are enhanced. There will be 3 issues, maybe we'll discuss them later. One is, I believe very much in the triangle, and that's I'm very much following the steps of Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin, who are very close friends of mine. They believe in the triangle between firms, the state, and civil society. Firms innovate. The state can play a role in redirecting technical change and innovation towards green through carbon price or through industrial policy or through subsidies to green innovation. We'll discuss that later. But civil society with consumers, shareholders, media can also play also a very important role. You can see really very much how the whole triangle there is important. But what I think I would like to discuss later is the industrial policy. Why is it important, and why can you make it compatible with competition? Because, you know, in the name of competition, people like Anne Kruger and others in the past said any form of industrial policy is bad. I don't believe so. I think we can reconcile industrial policy and competition policy. The second issue is how can we reform competition policy in Europe to make it more pro-innovation? It's too much market share based, not enough innovation based. And how can we have a good governance of industrial policy, but at the same time reform competition policy to have something that combines much better? And three, there is of course the carbon tariffs. How can we use the threat of carbon tariffs to avoid pollution heavens without falling into protectionism and into killing competition? So how can you intelligently use the threat of carbon tariffs without falling into straight protectionism? And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Aghion. And indeed, I want to come back to this issue, both of the industrial policy and also of consumer preferences, which I think is extremely interesting. But I want to go to Dr. Romero, because it looks like we need to reform competition enforcement and competition policy at large. So you've been reflecting a lot on this topic, the relationship between competition and green innovation, particularly in your roles at the European Commission. I wanted to ask you whether you can share a little bit your experience in this context. And, you know, for example, the European battery innovation and the hydrogen projects, where the European Commission effectively addresses a coordination problem to create a new market. So how do competition principles shape those initiatives in practice?
Thanks, Cristina. And thanks to the OECD, of course, for the invitation to participate in this panel. It is an honor for me to be surrounded by such eminent co-panelists to talk about such an interesting topic. Let me also say that, of course, here I speak on my personal capacity. My views may not represent, of course, and those of the European Commission. Just a first remark that I wanted to make. Now, as you have explained, Cristina, we are facing a difficult challenge, a very difficult policy situation for the next years, in the sense that we have to achieve this carbon neutrality, and there are probably, we need a multidimensional response to achieve it that will introduce environmental policy considerations, regulation, taxing, a lot of mobilization of private and public resources. And in this context, I think your question is very relevant. What is the role of competition policy in this policy mix that will be needed in order to achieve the climate targets that we have in front of us? And honestly, I think the introduction that you have made, it's very interesting. Now, you've talked about electrification. On the one hand, we need to be able to make our production processes cleaner, and one way of doing that is electrification. This requires technology adoption, technology change, investment. At the same time, electrification by itself probably is not the only solution. We also need to decarbonize our electricity generation. This will also require technology change. This will also require a lot of investment. And the question, therefore, is how do we achieve all this transformation? How we contribute to all this transformation? Let's say one possibility is to think of competition policy as complementary to environmental policy, right? And I think that's probably the clearest and the first contribution that competition policy can make. In order to achieve this transition in an efficient way, in order for the policy tools that we are putting in place from an environmental perspective to work well, we need competitive markets, we need efficient markets. We can think, for example, of the emission trading system. These are tools that are thought and designed to work in a context of competitive markets. So just by preserving competition in the markets, competition policy is already making an important contribution to the achievement of our decarbonization goals in an efficient way. I think that's something that probably, I think it's important that we all keep in mind. And then, of course, I think what Professor Aghion has said about innovation and about green innovation, that's also very, very important. I think on the one hand, there is all the discussion that there has been over the last years in antitrust, in merger control, about how to develop better theories of harm around innovation, how to look at the impact of possible practices, and not just from a static and short-term perspective of the immediate impact on markets, on market outcomes, on structure of the market or on prices of the market, but also to incorporate much more dynamic, a dynamic perspective. No? And I think if we can talk about it later a little bit more extensively, but we have seen already certain merger control decisions like GSK Novartis or Dow DuPont, where the Commission has already tried to develop this a bit more dynamic, a bit more open approach to what is the impact of certain mergers on incentives to innovate and on the likelihood that we are producing innovative outcomes. However, again, as Professor Aghion has said, it's not innovation per se, it's green innovation we are talking about. I think on this, your reference to I think, implicit reference to state aid control, I think it's important. Probably part of our audience is more or less familiar with the instrument of state aid control, which probably belongs to competition policy if we have a rather extensive interpretation of what competition policy and the role of competition authorities is. For historical reasons, for institutional reasons, the European Commission has this role of advising and supporting national governments in the European Union in defining policies, environmental policies, industrial policies, in such a way that they are minimally distortive of the markets in which they intervene, meaning that the objective of the policies are achieved, but that the distortions on competition are the minimal possible. And I think that experience, which probably was not a characteristic that emerged in the context of the discussion about environment, but it proves very useful now in the context of environmental discussion, in the sense that I think national competition authorities, supranational competition authorities, have a lot of knowledge about how to keep markets competitive, how to keep markets efficient, and how to therefore design industrial policies and environmental policies in such a way that the competitiveness of the markets and the efficiency of the markets are preserved. I think, and we can think of this in different contexts. Again, I don't want to be too extensive now because we will talk about it later. But for example, on the one hand is directing. There is a policy that can be of directing innovation towards certain policy options. Let's say hydrogen that you have already cited, the development of batteries. Here we have the specific type of a tool that the European Commission has developed, the important projects of common European interest, so-called, but it doesn't matter what is the exact form that it takes. The important thing is there is an important public effort towards the development of certain innovations that are green, that are promising. There are some market failures that may not be conducive to this innovation to take place. So the public authority has a role in pushing towards those innovations, and the competition authority can ensure or can help to ensure that this is done without creating artificial barriers to entry and exit, without consolidating inefficient incumbency positions that may lead to less innovation in the long run and to the exercise of market power in an inefficient way. Hence, making less efficient the path towards decarbonization. That's one example. The other example may be, and with that I finish, the interaction, as Professor Aghion has already cited, with the ETS, with the emission trading system. The emission trading system probably has a role in terms of internalization of the costs that otherwise are not internalized, and then therefore can help to the behavior change. And in that sense, competition per se may not be conducive to make the right choices in terms of decarbonization, but competition combined with other policies, and it can be the ETS, or we can think of other interventions to make consumers more aware of the external negative costs of their consumption choices. But the important thing is it is the combination of competition policy, preserving competitiveness, plus the right direction from the policymakers in terms of environmental policy that will probably put us in the right policy path and development path towards decarbonization.
Thank you so much, Dr. Romero, for this very comprehensive explanation of a little bit what's the state of thinking in Europe. And on this note, I'd like to turn to Professor Cheng Because in your books and your research, you focused a lot on the relationship between competition law enforcement and economic development, and particularly looking at developing countries. So I wanted to ask you if you can give us your views on the specific challenges that are faced by these countries in the trade-off between the goal of green transition and other policy goals. And you know, what kind of challenges competition authorities in emerging economies perhaps face when advocating for competition policy to promote green innovation.
Thank you, Cristina and Ruben, for having me on the panel, and I'm very honored to be on a panel of such esteemed and distinguished speakers, and especially Professor Aghion. I've consulted your work extensively in my own research, and it's an honor for me to be sharing a panel with you. I think much of the discussion with the rest of the panelists will be on competition policy. So I think I'll focus more on competition law enforcement by competition authorities in developing countries as such, because I am a competition lawyer by trade. So in terms of the possibilities and challenges, I think the challenges are manifold. When you are looking at how a competition authority should balance between competition law, competition considerations, and green innovation, there's actually three moving parts. There's competitive effects, there's innovation, and there's greenness of the innovation, or sustainability of the innovation. And this is not just a trade-off between two things, but a trade-off between three things. So as you can imagine, it's quite complicated. And in terms of undertaking a balancing exercise in a concrete case, I would say it's helpful to take a step back and look at when balancing would be, when a balancing exercise would be necessary. You have, I mean, if we just focus on competition and innovation, you have four possible scenarios. One is both competition and innovation is enhanced by a business practice. Both competition and innovation is harmed by a business practice. In these two scenarios, there's really no need to balance because they both point to the same direction. And if you have a situation where innovation is enhanced but competition is disadvantaged, that is really regulation should be doing the most of the job, because if you have a pro-competitive conduct but produces environmental detriment, it really should not be a competition law enforcement's job to remove competitive environmental harm, because the conduct is pro-competitive, and competition law enforcement certainly should not be used to police pro-competitive conduct. And so the real need for balancing arises when competition is harmed and the environment is enhanced, or environmental benefits are produced when they point in opposite directions. And so here there's really no way to avoid a balancing exercise, balancing between competitive harm and innovation benefits. And I would say this kind of balancing is very difficult even for an established authority in an advanced jurisdiction, let alone a developing country authority. And I would say that developing country authorities should be very careful in undertaking this kind of exercise. And actually, I would later on address this kind of how this kind of balancing exercise should be conducted in more concrete detail. But the good thing is, I think in reality, a developing country competition authority is probably less likely to encounter the need to undertake this kind of balancing exercise, because first, we know that most innovations come from developed countries, from industrialized economies. And in the most recent WIPO, World Intellectual Property Indicators report, we know that, over 90% of patent applications and patent grants are found in developed countries when China is excluded. China, of course, accounts for almost 1/3 of patent applications and grants, and China is just a sui generis country. And so if we exclude that, however, among the rest of the countries, the industrialized economies are responsible for most of the innovation. So what that means is when a developing country competition authority is really confronted with the need to balance between competition and innovation, it's usually in the context not of producing the innovation itself, but adapting a foreign technology to a local economy. And so I believe when what is being balanced against is technology adaptation, technology transfer, it's usually a bit easier because I think there's less uncertainty involved as opposed to the original R&D that produces the innovation. Because as we know, R&D is fraught with uncertainty and risks, and R&D often fails. So how much weight do we attach to a certain innovation effort and certain R&D effort can be difficult to decide. But when the technology is already created and we're only talking about adapting the technology to the local economy, I think the uncertainty and the risks involved are much lower. And I think the success of the outcome is probably easier to ascertain. And so in that sense, I think balancing is difficult when you're balancing between competition and innovation. In a concrete case, it's because of the uncertainty of our R&D and innovation. It's not easy, but at least I think in the context of developing countries, I believe the need is, I believe the difficulty will be a bit less because I think developing country competition authorities are less likely to be confronted with competition and genuine innovation and R&D from scratch, so to speak. And Professor Aghion mentioned the scale effects and the China effect, and when the market expands, there'll be greater pollution, so to speak, and a greater carbon footprint. And so one may think, wow, there may be, I mean, obviously for every developing country, one of the most important policy goals is to alleviate poverty and to promote economic development, which is a concern very close to my heart. And the interesting thing is, there was a study published in Nature Sustainability, I believe 2 weeks ago, which actually looks at this issue in particular. And the issue is, what would be the carbon footprint of reduced poverty? What would be the carbon footprint of lifting, a substantial amount of the population in developing countries out of poverty? And no surprise there, because we know that a majority of the carbon emission in the world is generated by developed jurisdictions, by developed countries, and developing countries generally are responsible for much less carbon emission, obviously the notable exception being China, and especially the poor population in developing countries is responsible for even less. And so, this study by Benedict Bruckner from University of Groningen, they show that 350 million Indians in extreme poverty is only responsible for 1/10 of the country's emissions, and lifting them out of extreme poverty would only increase India's carbon emissions by 4%. And they further find that if we were to lift 3.6 billion people above the poverty line of $5.5 per day, global emissions would only increase by 18%. Whereas if the world's top half emitters half their carbon footprints, our global total emissions would fall by 40%. So the good news is economic development and poverty reduction, poverty alleviation probably suffers less from the scale effects or the China effects. So the good news is the two of them are not inconsistent with each other, or terribly inconsistent with each other, to the extent that we may need to give up on economic developments in the name of promoting reducing carbon emissions. I think I'll stop here right now, and I'll look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, Professor Cheng. This was extremely interesting. And well, we started discussing a little bit of the balancing that conciliating competition with environmental protection may require. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into you know, issues related to competition enforcement. But before that, Professor Diane Coyle, you've been also, among other functions, part of the Independent Industrial Strategy Council in the UK. What can you share about your views of the role of regulations versus that of competition in advancing green innovation goals? And is there any economic understanding that we may need to question to ensure that competition works for green innovation?
Thank you, Cristina. I'd like to echo my colleagues and say what a privilege it is to be in such distinguished company today. And we've already had a very rich set of issues raised to carry on discussing. I think I'd like to start by pointing out what a huge structural change in the economy we're talking about. We're talking about changing the energy system, the transport networks, infrastructure, construction. A lot of these are network industries with large economies of scale and natural monopoly characteristics. And so the policy challenge is quite a big one, and we want to bring about this transformation as quickly as we can. And so competition policy isn't always going to be the main tool or the best tool. And actually, sometimes there'll be trade-offs between different kinds of policies. And I think if we can dig into these trade-offs, it's going to be a really interesting discussion. To give one example that I've been working on with my colleague, Rahima Unsulwa, we're looking at the construction industry and how it can become more productive, but also greener and decarbonize. And that's going to require cooperation along the supply chain to reduce waste, to standardize components, to off-site manufacturing, to install sensors into infrastructure to monitor their operation, to build for energy efficiency and to recycle buildings and so on. This is going to require common standards, interoperability, and data sharing along the whole of the supply chain, from designers and architects all the way through to infrastructure operators at the other end. And competition authorities have, for understandable reasons, always been very cautious about information sharing among industry participants. But this is something that needs to be thought about. Previously, you gave the example of electrification, Cristina. We had the market competition over standards there. Similarly, with some of the digital standards, the markets fought out that battle. But if we want to achieve green transition quickly, we might not want to leave it to those competing market forces, but to think about setting standards in a regulatory way or having discussions between industry and regulators to set the standards platform. I also think that we're going to need regulation. Philippe made the really important point that consumer preferences and norms are changing, and this is driving the innovation. But I think it needs regulation also, because even with that force, governments need to de-risk the investment to the extent they can by assuring investors this will be a market at scale and that there won't be too much technological uncertainty or too much uncertainty about the timing. But we know that regulation can be an entry barrier. And so we need to think about that trade-off between inducing the innovation, de-risking the market, but making sure that it's not discouraging new entrants. And then, as you alluded to in your question, there's also an interaction with state aid and industrial policies. We want to bring about this big shift in production and consumption. Some of the technologies we need can be imported. China can manufacture photovoltaic cells at scale very efficiently and cost effectively. Maybe we just want to import those to Europe. But there are also questions that people are asking in the industrial strategy domain about what's the location of skills and know-how? What about jobs in domestic markets? What about security of supply issues, which we've seen in the digital arena when it comes to silicon chips? And so for me, this highlights the fact there are lots of trade-offs to be debated here, because for competition policy, we're not just talking about making existing markets work competitively, which we've got a great toolkit to do, but about shaping new markets. It's the innovations, but also who are the market participants, how are those markets going to operate? And the decisions that competition authorities take will actually start shaping markets rather than making existing markets work more effectively, which is what we've thought about before. So in his remarks, Philippe made the really important point that competition policy hasn't always paid enough attention to these dynamics. And this is his territory, so I'm going to defer to what he says about this. But I do agree with that. And in some senses, the issues here are the same as the issues in digital markets. How do we update the competition toolkit to think about the dynamics of markets, the new entrants, and how policymakers in ministries as well as competition authorities shape that landscape to enable the market to operate as competitively as possible. I don't think I've got anything more to add to the really rich points that others have already made. So back to you, Cristina.
Thank you so much. And I think that, you know, this first round of remarks have been already raising a lot of interesting issues. Maybe digging a little bit deeper, where I think there's a lot of interest on this, on how to conduct the analysis in practice in competition enforcement. I think there's a lot of debate, and we hear this particularly in Europe, on whether competition enforcement may also promote green innovation, and also about whether there should be more scope for considering efficiencies in that context. But there is also, Professor Cheng has alluded to this, there is also, though, the mirror image of that, which is whether competition authorities should be vigilant to ensure that they prevent anti-competitive conduct and transactions that harm green innovation and the environment more generally. And one recent example of that is the fine applied by the European Commission to 3 large car manufacturers for agreeing to slow down the deployment of emission cleaning technologies in diesel cars. And there it was the first time that the Commission concluded that colluding on technical developments constitutes a cartel. So competition authorities can also apply theories of harm in merger control and if they want to protect the pace and amount of green innovation, and they can theoretically block green killer acquisitions that aim at discontinuing green research projects. So just, you know, staying with you, Professor Coyle, what are your views on the potential conflicts that can emerge in the assessment, the take that we should have on how we look at dynamic effects? Is there any difference between a situation where we have to do with basic innovation, where we're looking to develop a specific technology, and situation where it is a matter of reaching scale, disseminating?
I think it's quite a tough question, actually. There's a standard toolkit for thinking about efficiencies from mergers, and I'm always skeptical that efficiencies will get passed on to consumers, and I don't think there's any particular reason to believe that cost savings from a merger will get directed to green investment. And we know that in some of these markets, there are incumbents with an old technology who are very keen to protect their market position and are wary of cannibalizing that with the new technologies, but at the same time want to dominate the new technology when that comes along. And I think there's just a real question about, if you like, what level of the technology stack you're going to say we set the standards, and how is that going to come about? And I do come down on the side of thinking that there needs to be inter-industry debate about what those technical standards are. There are examples from the digital territory of information sharing agreements in the steel sector or the chemical sector in Germany, for instance, which they cleared with the Bundeskartellamt in advance. And I think that kind of discussion might be really useful in some of these areas, where to get the efficiencies that I was talking about along the construction chain across the whole economy, then that's the kind of issue that we need to be debating more broadly. I think it was Lluís who said there are not theories of harm about innovation. So this is a challenge for economists and universities, as well as in competition authorities, thinking about how to articulate those theories of harm, which will probably differ with different parts of the technologies that we're talking about. It'll be different with batteries, for instance, versus construction or building energy efficiency. So in a sense, I'm saying it depends. There's a lot of granularity in this that we need to get our heads around, so it's quite hard to generalize. But I do think that there has to be the cooperation, which is best actually led by perhaps best led by competition authorities.
Also, perhaps cooperation does give the advantage that monitoring it's much easier than it would be with a merger, where the situation in the market change in the long term and structurally. Professor Cheng, as a legal expert, do you share Professor Coyle's views on this? And does the need to support green innovation affect the way in which we should look at harm and efficiencies in antitrust cases generally? I'm thinking in particular about cooperation agreements and abuse of dominance investigation, if that's relevant.
Right. I guess before I answer a question, I should clarify. I think I agree with the rest of the panel that competition policy has a strong role to play in promoting green innovation. But I think I do exercise a bit more caution when it comes to competition law enforcement. I do draw a distinction between competition policy and competition law enforcement. And I also want to draw on the concepts of supportive integration and preventative integration that Julian Novak first proposed in his book. I think at least in terms of competition law enforcement, the role should be largely confined to preventative integration, preventing barriers to competition that will hold back the emergence of green innovation. I think the role of competition law enforcement should be mostly to ensure a level playing field so that a green innovation will be given the opportunity to emerge when that's what the market wants. And so, I mean, you alluded to it earlier. I mean, to the extent there's abuse of dominance against a new entrant who would like to introduce a new green technology against an incumbent who is who employs a more polluting technology, and as Professor Aghion mentioned, there's path dependency, and it would be unsurprising for the incumbents to have every incentive to stifle or stymie the emergence of a new green technology. I think that is when competition law enforcement truly has a role to play, and a very important role to play. But this is also where I think competition considerations and innovation point in the same direction, because competition is being stifled with the attendant consequence of holding back innovation. And I think that is truly when a competition authority should play a very active role. And I think another example is perhaps horizontal cooperation agreements that may establish a new industry standard for a new technology, or as Diane mentioned, information exchange. I think, I mean, to the extent the competition authority is satisfied that there's bona fide benefits in terms of innovation through the information exchange or standard setting, and the competition authority can, I think, impose a lot of behavioral remedies to make sure that the horizontal cooperation agreements does not become de facto price fixing, or does not give the firms involved the opportunity to engage in price fixing or the cartel behavior. And I think so long as those safeguards are in place, I do believe that the competition authority should take a generally permissive view to industry standard setting or information exchange that will promote innovation. And I believe that's, I mean, from my reading of the decision practices of the European Commission, that's what the European Commission has generally adopted. The line, I mean, the CECED case, for example, the very famous one about washing machines. And I mean, I think in that case, there was no question that, I mean, some of the polluting models were being killed off. So competition in the very classic static sense is being constrained, but the innovation benefits and the green benefits are also fairly substantial and uncontrovertible. So in that instance, I believe the European Commission took the right decision. Allow competition to be static competition to be stymied in the name of promoting innovation and green technology. So I mean, yeah, as I said, I think there are certainly instances where the competition authority can play a role in terms of, by way of competition enforcement. But in terms of competition policy, I mean, the toolkit is a lot broader, and there are a lot of things that, I mean, both the competition authority and the rest of the governments can do to promote green innovation through competition policy. And I think that's where we can continue the discussion with the rest of the panel.
Yes, indeed. But I wanted a clarification on the question of dynamic effects, whether you actually do see that non-price effects are going to be given in this context of green innovation a bigger role by competition authorities. Can I just quickly get a reaction from Professor Coyle, perhaps, and then Dr. Romero on this?
So very quickly, I think the answer is yes. And there's always been scope to look at non-price effects. And clearly, when you're talking about these dynamic changes, they become more important. So yes, is the answer to your question.
And how easy it is in practice, Dr. Romero, to do this? Does it require a big shift in the way we're thinking about the competitive assessment? And is this one of the ways in which we can, perhaps following the suggestion that Professor Aghion gave at the beginning, a way to make it less market share based and more pro green innovation? Is this the solution?
I think
solution?
Thanks, Cristina. I think I was referring to it before. No, I think that the enforcement has been recognizing increasingly the importance of taking into account dynamic effects and taking into account incentives to innovate, and how certain proposals, be it agreements, be it mergers, may have on these incentives to innovate, not only close to the market, but also even up in the R&D process. No, and I think indeed, we need to understand that probably the mere fact of having less innovation is in itself something that we should worry about, and it's not just the effect that this will have through prices or through market structure in the market in 1 or 2 or 3 years, but we should have a longer perspective, or not necessarily a longer perspective, but focusing on what in the next few years it means in terms of how much innovation and how much progress, technological progress, we will have. What I also think is that all these changes have already taken place without a need of a profound revision of our rules, in the sense that we have already seen, I was citing some cases before, GSK, Novartis, Dow DuPont, now certain agreements have been cited, where there has been the option of recognizing the innovation impact of the practices without revamping completely how we look at antitrust and merger control enforcement. I think one thing that I would just, if I may, want to referring back to something that Professor Coyle has said, no, and I think fully agree with her. No, I mean we need to create an environment that is conducive to the innovation that is needed to take place, to the technology adoption that is needed to take place, and this environment is in part relying on competitive markets, and it requires therefore antitrust enforcement, merger control enforcement, and at the same time policy choices at the environmental policy level. And of course there can be initiatives that come from the private sector, and of course, because there is this knowledge in the private sector about what can work. At the same time, there has to be a dialogue with policymakers, with regulators, and of course, as Professor Aghion has said before, with civil society. Because it is from this interaction that we will probably be able to make choices that introduce and that take into account public interest, rather than just private interest of those that are taking an agreement. So I think that's important, because trying to delegate completely the decision-making on standards to private companies, self-regulation, may not be necessarily the most clever or most appropriate way of finding optimal choices. And therefore, that's why the triangulation is important, and the introduction of public interest in the choice making is very important.
Thank you so much. And I do not want to stall the discussion, but this is extremely interesting. And I was wondering whether I can get like a comment, a quick one, maybe again from you, Dr. Romero, and from Professor Aghion, in a context where innovation by small players tend to be more radical than those of large players, also, you know, the interplay with this path dependence phenomenon, is there a heightened risk of seeing green killer acquisition emerging in these markets? Can I ask a prediction?
No, so I think it's important to have entrant innovation. So that's why also when you want to think about industrial policy and competition policy. So on competition policy, I wanted just to say that indeed, as was emphasized by you know, other panelists and Diane particularly, and then Thomas, Lluís, we need really to move to a more pro-innovation practice of competition policy. Let me give you just an example. Siemens Alstom was I mean, I don't want to be, again, I think most of what the Competition Commission does is good, but I never understood very well that decision, because it was made on to prevent Alstom Siemens on the ground that all fast trains were bought from Siemens or Alstom. So it was a market share argument, but it's a contestable market. Anybody can buy high-speed trains from China. No, nothing would prevent it. It was just an example of still progress to be made to make competition policy more pro-innovation. And Richard Gilbert has a very good book at MIT Press saying that, of course, the same is true in the US even more, to make competition policy more pro-innovation. I know I take note of what Lluís said about progress being made in that direction, but there are still well-known cases where it was too much the market share view and not enough the pro-innovation view that prevailed. The next thing is industrial policy. We need to have industrial policy because we need to invest in green innovation in Europe particularly, but we need to be pro-competition. So there is the whole issue of the governance of industrial policy, which is pro-competition. A good model is the DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency model. You know, US in the 50s, money comes from the top, but then you have team leaders and they elicit competing projects. It worked with the BARDA, with the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, thanks to which we had Johnson, Pfizer, Moderna vaccine. And it's very interesting because it's a way to do industrial policy, which is pro-competition. And I think if we have a competition policy that becomes more pro-innovation, and I take note of what Lluís said about the progress being made there. And on the other hand, we have an industrial policy which is more pro-competition. I think we can articulate the two much better. In Europe, it was not so well done, the two, so far. And I think that's a kind of, I think this governance thing is a very important one to reform. Is that the question you asked me? And then, of course, when it comes to green innovation, I think we should create a ARPA energy in Europe. Of course, when I say Europe, I include the UK, of course, because we have to move post-COVID in all areas like health, energy, or digital, where I would push for the creation of DARPAs. The UK are extremely good, and it would be a very bad idea not to include the UK with the rest of Europe in those things. And I think I think that we have to move in that direction. That's what I would push for. Yeah.
Professor Aghion, just to follow up on this, my $1 million question for you, but also, of course, then I want to hear the reaction from the other panelists, is we know that competition policy and enforcement promote innovation, but they are generally at this stage, as you were mentioning, neutral to the type of innovation, green or polluting, that they support. So in a scenario where we don't have a lot of time to take drastic measures to fight climate change, and also in a scenario where fiscal space perhaps is limited in some country more than in others, does it make sense for governments to intervene, putting large amounts of money in green innovation, regulating in a green direction, and then for competition authorities to be agnostic to the type of innovation they support with their enforcement and advocacy activity?
No, they have to check ex post. I believe in the combination. I believe in an industrial policy where governments put money, but then the governance is very much a DARPA type, combined with making sure that those investments will not reduce competition. And that's where, but I think already the Competition Commission in Europe is moving that way. Before, it used to be ex ante, any form of state aid is bad. Now they move more and more into an ex post empirical approach, which is to say you can do things and then we'll check ex post if you reduce competition or not. When you give money to a sector, it has to be not to one firm only. It has to preserve competition, and it has to factor in entry. You don't want this to favor incumbents at the expense of entrants. So those are the things where the Competition Commission has to check. Not be a priori against sectoral state aid, but say, look, guys, you do sectoral state aid. We will look carefully at the governance, and we will look at whether entry was reduced or competition was reduced because of that. And if it is, we intervene. You see, that's the way I see the articulation between competition policy and industrial policy.
I see. Dr. Romero, would you like to comment on this?
No, indeed, I mean, I can comment, I cannot comment because I subscribe most of what Professor Aghion has said. Indeed, I mean, if we look at things that have happened and are happening at the moment. So the Commission has adopted the IPCI batteries decisions, is working on the IPCI hydrogen decisions. Here, what we are saying is this, we are saying there is a technology change that needs to be supported. There are possible coordination issues. We need to bring all these initiatives together in an open way, with open calls, so that everyone has a chance to get the support that is needed. And also with commitments that whatever will be developed through this support will be open to those that couldn't participate. So some commitments, if you look at the batteries, at the IPCI batteries, some commitments to open some of the results of the innovation process to the access from third parties. So of course, I mean, we can debate how it is done exactly, can it be done better or not, but I think we are going very much in this direction. The other thing, just to be also concrete, the climate, environmental and energy state aid guidelines that have been adopted now in January, which are public in the domain. I think they are at the same time a compendium of what we have learned over the last years. We have had a previous experience through renewables, all the support to renewables. If you go 15 years ago, many people didn't think that the potential that they had would be so great in terms of becoming efficient so quickly, scaling up so quickly, and being integrated into energy generation markets so quickly. This has been a process that was accompanied by public support, so that the nascent technologies could develop and mature quickly, could be adopted quickly, and at the same time with increasing market integration and being put into under the pressure of competition. Now we have new technologies that are developing that require infrastructure investments, that require R&D taking risks, investors taking risks in terms of developing the technology, in terms of adopting the technology. And it's here where the industrial policy needs to accompany this process, and the competition policy needs to ensure that this process does not lead to concentrated markets, to uncompetitive markets, because this means, in the end, is self-defeating. If we have concentrated markets, we are putting the cost of the transition at such a high level that it will be unfair, inefficient, and unsustainable. So that's why we need, in the end, I mean, if you want to put it in a phrase, that's why we need competitive markets, and competition policy has to ensure that. And it's the main objective that it has to ensure.
Maybe a comment from Professor Coyle, if she wants to intervene on this.
I largely agree with two reservations. One is that some of the industries that need to change technologies are network or natural monopoly industries, and I think that's a different kind of challenge. And the other is that short-run economic efficiency may not be everything, and if you're talking about industrial policies, that you might want to make an argument for locating know-how and expertise in your home market, which would put some reservations around the idea that there's always going to be international contestability. I think we're in a world where that's actually just less secure than it used to be.
Yeah, COVID really showed these. And Professor Cheng, what about competition authorities that don't have perhaps state aid powers? Do competition authorities have the skill set and expertise to determine whether a technology is green or not, to support the design of a specific measure? At what point in the design of the policy can they be can they intervene? Can they be consulted? Is there any room for cooperation with environmental agencies? Oh, sorry, how do you see the debate?
Right. So thank you, Cristina. But before I answer your question, I would also like to echo what was said earlier by the other three panelists. I think there's no question that innovation should be, innovation benefits should be given credit, and I mean a lot of credit in competition analysis. And I believe as a field we've long been too obsessed with price effects because price effects are allegedly more quantifiable. And I think economists have told us for a long time that dynamic efficiency and innovation results in much greater improvements in welfare than static efficiency gains. And there's no reason why in competition analysis we should not give due credit to innovation. I think the difficulty is, to me, the question is not so much whether we should give credit to innovation benefits, but how do we handle the issue of the uncertainty of innovation when innovation is by no means certain and there's a lot of risks and possibility of failure. How do we take that into account? And I think that is really where the difficulty really is. If you tell me that a particular horizontal cooperation agreement has a great chance, or almost complete certainty in producing an innovation, by all means, to me, it just seems to make no sense for us to not give any credit to that. And to your question, I guess to the extent, to answer your, the question that you posed to the other three panelists first, is the ideal way where the government uses state aid, subsidies, environmental regulation to push the development of the technology in a particular direction, and the competition authority ensures a level playing field and make sure that every competitor has the same opportunity. I believe that's probably the best way for most most competition authorities to go about it, especially for developing country authorities. Because I'm all for using industrial policy and competition policy to support the developments of green innovation. But what I have reservations about is asking the competition authority to pick winners among different technologies and to evaluate which is greener and which is less green. Not to mention, competition authorities do not have the expertise to evaluate the greenness of a technology. And it also opens the floodgates to competition authorities picking winners. And I think the most valuable asset of a competition authority is the perception of impartiality in an open and free market. And I think there are other government agencies and ministries that are much better positioned to help choose the correct technology or to steer the development of the technology in the right direction. But I do have reservations about asking competition authorities to do that job. And obviously, if despite my reservations, it is decided that competition authorities should nonetheless be tasked to do that, then obviously competition authorities would need to collaborate with other government ministries, perhaps the environmental ministry, etc. For the required expertise. But I do believe that the best way to situate the competition authority in this whole matrix is exactly what you described earlier. Use government subsidies and other policies to push the development of the technology in a certain desired direction, but let the competition authority make sure that every firm that meets the environmental regulation have the same opportunity to succeed.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take a question from the audience, which is asked by Maurice Dolmans, who is a lawyer at Clear Gottlieb, and he's been writing on this topic a lot. And it's a very pragmatic question. So it notes that we suggested that we need efficient markets, that we need regulation, that we need good interaction between these measures, but also, consumers to be more aware and make the right choices, let's say, that can support green innovation. And he suggests, why then not adopt a competition policy that allows the private sector to play its role and cooperate only where needed to overcome market failure, free rider, first mover disadvantage where there is no willingness to pay. At the same time, compensating for the regulatory failure that may or may not affect different countries, and perhaps even our current state of regulation is not enough to reach the Paris goals, and where no clear technology is available. Because one of the things that he points out, well known in the private sector, is that there's a lot of potential for initiative, and also perhaps a clear vision of where efficiencies could be. Is this something that it's never ideal? So it could ever a cooperation, an artificially created market power by allowing a cooperation between competitors play the role of a carbon tax or of a regulation? Could we use private sector in initiative in that way? Maybe Dr. Romero.
Thanks. I think, just a first reaction, but I would be curious to listen also to my co-panelists. When I think of market failures, I think of market failures in terms of the market outcome in relation to either social welfare or consumer welfare. We can discuss about that. And then addressing a market failure as intervening in the market to try to restore the ability of the market outcome to be closer to an optimal solution in terms of either social welfare or consumer welfare. And in that sense, I think what Professor Aghion has talked about before, the triangulation, it's important. I think it can be a bit naive, if you excuse myself for the expression, to think that companies alone may be the right interpreters of what is the solution that maximizes either social welfare or consumer welfare. They don't have the incentives, then they don't have this objective function. So by themselves, I'm skeptical. Together with the policymaker and the civil society, probably yes. And that's what needs to be understood. So I think, and there is, what does this mean? It means that when we want to address a market failure, we want to address it either through market design or through a policy intervention in the market. That's the normal thing to do. If it's a subsidy, it's because we have a diffused benefit that will be achieved. And also, typically, we finance it through a diffused taxing system that makes a matching between who gets the benefit, who gets the cost, who pays the cost, and it is kind of aggregated according to social preferences by this triangulation. Having the exercise of market power concentrated on a given market and set of customers in order to achieve a societally wide benefit, and without the intervention of those that could aggregate efficiently social preferences, be it civil society, be it governments, policymakers, I think it is a bit of an heroic task. So that's why my skepticism, purely from this reasoning, comes from. I probably am skeptical. It may be in some cases, but I'm skeptical.
And can I ask a bit of like a follow-up question on this? Do we have an issue with all types of information exchange and cooperation? And do we think that perhaps there could be more scope for cooperating along the supply chain? One big problem is always for a big supplier to consider how to address type 3 emissions along its supply chain. Is cooperation the way? Is this something that Professor Coyle, you were referring to, sort of like something analogous to this about the construction sector, that we should perhaps have a different way of looking at information exchange in this context?
We're certainly going to need agreed standards and an understanding of the technology involved. I would share the skepticism about leaving this to private sector players. If you think about the parallel discussions in digital markets, you wouldn't want to leave the big tech companies to have these discussions among themselves, because their incentives are different, and they can use their technical know-how as one of the barriers to entry. So you certainly need all of the other participants in these exchanges too. I think of it in terms of setting standards, setting metadata, and ensuring that there's some oversight of the kinds of information that are exchanged. One of the examples might be the open banking standards in the UK, which they've had mixed reviews, but that has been a regulatory body working with the industry to define APIs and metadata so that it will enable new entry or other entrants to serve different parts of the supply chain. So that's the kind of territory that I think is needed. And I would completely agree, you can't just leave this to the private sector. Information asymmetries mean that the market is not going to provide the solution by itself.
It's very clear. I want to ask you a little bit more about, how competition policy can help address market failures in the context of this discussion. And on this, some competition authorities, particularly in Europe, have started to take sort of like an initial position at least. The discussion about the need to take into account out-of-market effects, possibly, of conduct and mergers in the competitive assessment. Do we see only risks to this approach, or is this something that somehow can be taken into account? I would maybe ask you all just a quick comment on this, starting with Dr. Romero.
Thanks, Cristina. I think the discussion is indeed very interesting, and for me the answer is the continuation of what I said before. Personally, just speaking by myself, I see a mismatch between the diffuse benefits of certain positive externalities or negative externalities and the cost of exercising market power that is inflicted on a set of customers. I think this mismatch may mean that the optimal policy tool for intervention sometimes may not be competition enforcement. Where the benefits really concentrated within the market to a large extent, then it would be easier to make a balancing that makes some sense and that is reasonable. But of course, then I'm not answering your question, which is about explicitly out-of-market efficiencies. So I think there is a discussion there that it is very interesting. I think the discussion should not be only whether it could be possible to do it more or less well through competition enforcement, but also whether in the end, competition enforcement is the right tool to take into account these out-of-market efficiencies, or whether there are other policy tools that are better placed.
Professor Cheng, do you agree with this answer?
Right. I think my sense of the issue is quite similar to Dr. Romero's sense. I mean, when we talk about out of market, I mean, I presume you talk about out of market environmental benefits and green benefits. So how do we balance between in-market competition effects and out of market green effects or environmental effects? And I mean, first of all, there's the difficult issue of how do you quantify the benefits of reduced carbon emission that helps reduce global warming. I mean, we're talking about the entire globe here. And I mean, we're comparing the effects in a particular market and the effects on a global scale. And I don't know how we can make a meaningful balancing in that instance. And also, I mean, I'm also generally fairly skeptical about balancing. I mean, it's very hard to do balancing, and I think it's easy to think in the abstract, you are going to quantify the cost and benefits and balance them against each other. But in reality, that's very hard to do. And in a lot of cases, that's not really how it is done. And I think we need to be realistic about how accurately we can undertake a balancing exercise. And I mean, how accurately we can quantify the harms and benefits, and I mean, are they even commensurable? Can we even balance them against each other? Yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Professor Coyle, maybe a comment from you?
A very brief one, which is that as well as the existence of the efficiencies, I think you always need to look at the incentives and what would be done with those efficiencies. And I guess that is always something that has to be assessed case by case.
And Professor Aghion, one of the arguments about efficiencies, and this is also something that's been mentioned by Professor Gilbert, that you were talking about before, is that we're very skeptical about fixed costs and fixed cost saving to be passed on to consumer. Perhaps it's similar in the case of R&D cost saving. And one of the arguments that Professor Gilbert gives is, in the same way there's a little bit less certainty when we are looking at the possible harm to innovation, perhaps we can also be a bit more careful into ruling out the possibility that some of these efficiencies may be passed on to consumers. Is there like a change in the assessment that we need to adopt, the way in which we look at spillovers, the way in which we look at the benefits of innovation?
Yeah, no, that's a difficult question. I mean, because, that's right. It's a dynamic gains. I mean, so, you cost reduction, how, who benefits, who doesn't benefit, and what are the metrics. And so of course, it's harder to do competition policy, aimed at fostering innovation than just looking at market share, which is static. So it's more challenging. But now we have, we have data, we have much more information that we can use to guide the kind of competition policy the way Rich Gilbert would like it to be reformed. We need to be much more, looking at, indicators, patents. Now we have, on patenting, there are very good metrics of patents or new firm creation or new, and then look at CO2 emission, and then look at, you see, I mean, we have various indicators we can combine and to have much more refined policies than we used to have before. That's the whole goal. I mean, I would like to broaden the thing. Europe particularly, we face the challenge that we have to make big investments. We saw the health sector, we see the energy sector, but we have a lot of debt as well. With COVID, we had to increase our debt. And so the whole issue is how to manage this. Before, there used to be the Maastricht Treaty that says, more than, if your deficit is more than 3% of GDP, no matter what you spend on, that's bad, you are in the red, okay? Now we will have to move into, I call that Mario Draghi way of doing things. I want to, but more saying, let's look at the composition of public spending. If you spend on growth enhancing investment and or on investment that enhance on the environment, that should be factored in. And of course, anybody could claim that what you are spending on is on environment or growth. And that's where governance is important. And that's where, performance measures are very important. So in fact, it's a very demanding approach where you subject yourself, say, okay, I invest in education. It has to translate at some moment into PISA test or test scores or whatever, you see, or, employment of, job creation or whatever. You invest in innovation, it has to translate at some point into patents or new firm creation or productivity growth. And I think we will have to go that way. You see what I mean? More. We can't be as before, I don't care what you spend, how you spend your money, more than 3% of GDP, that you are in the red. No, you have to be more, but that's where it is, now there are new measures, and I know that OECD, but also the European Commission now is looking much more, we saw the data, you look much more seriously into micro data, and the micro data will be very important in monitoring, the way governments spend their money and make them much more accountable. And I think that's the direction where we have to go, because otherwise, how can we both foster innovation in Europe? Because we know that on innovation compared to China and the US, Europe is declining. So we have to do something about this. And at the same time, we have this big debt. So how we deal with that? And the other thing is that we have the monetary debt and the environmental debt, because we could decide that, to solve the debt problem, we don't do anything about the environment. But then we increase the burden on future generations because the environmental debt is going up. How do we manage these two debts at the same time? You see what I mean? Those are the issues that we have to come to grip with. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so time flew, so it has been an extremely interesting discussion, and it's now time to conclude. I want our speakers to share with us one last key message to end the session. And whilst you think about your messages, if I can make an attempt to summarize what has been said without, expectation of being exhaustive, one main theme that has emerged is that to start and sustain the virtuous circle of innovation, I think it's extremely important to apply the right mix of fiscal and competition policy measures. This can be ranging from well-calibrated carbon taxes, research subsidies, standard setting, regulation, conditionality of state aid, a mix of all of these. A second important point is that not only the right policy mix, but also crucially getting the timing right is important, because the larger the gap between a dirty technology and its clean substitute, and the harder it will become to go green. And a third point is, we see a bit of a role for competition enforcement. Perhaps we need to change a few things in the way we're thinking about non-price effects, particularly trying to, move away a little bit from market share based, kind of thinking, and taking into account more innovation, develop the instrument to do that. But we can try to prevent anti-competitive content and transactions that harm green innovation, try to ensure free entry of new innovators in the market. And this role will be complementary to the role of carbon taxes, regulation, and state aid. And even more important, I think, is to understand very well the interaction between these different policy measures, and to make sure that competition principles really inform the design of these other measures that require competitive markets to be successful. And we may have to find more opportunities, I guess, for cooperation and exchange between competition authorities and other policymakers to ensure that these policies are truly competition friendly. Now, I would like to give our speaker the floor again to leave our audience with a takeaway message on green innovation. And I'd like to start with Professor Cheng, please.
Right. Thank you, Cristina. I think I have two messages. The first one is, I think the relationship between competition and green innovation is myriad and complex, and a lot of policy tools can be brought to bear. Competition law enforcement is part of the discussion, but the role it may play may not. I mean, we may probably need more than just competition law enforcement to help promote green innovation through competition. And I think the second message I have is, and as a number of speakers have highlighted already, there is, our theory of harm in relation to innovation is not as well developed as we would like, and perhaps we need better economic understanding of how competition and market structure relates to innovation. I know the relationship is myriad and complex, and it's hard to generalize whether one type of market structure is more conducive to innovation or an other. And I think it's largely because of this, I guess, lack of a more solid, clear understanding that still holds us back from, I guess, taking innovation in our competition law enforcement more seriously. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Professor Cheng. Dr. Romero?
Thanks, Cristina. I think you have made a marvelous, a perfect summary. So little to add, just to say, as I said at the beginning, there is a big challenge, a marvelous challenge in front of us, and we will need all our resources to be up to this challenge. And competition policy, for sure, has a role in it. And probably, as I see, this role is in preserving competition and efficient markets in order to have a decarbonization that is at the same time efficient and at the same time fair. And just a note in saying that at the same time, we have to bear in mind, I've been talking a lot about the European Commission because that's my experience, but this is a global challenge. So we must make it efficient and fair also from a global perspective.
Professor Aghion?
You did a great job at wrapping up the whole session and summarizing. Clearly, we know because of the past dependence phenomenon, entry is key. I mean, making sure that you have new entry and new firms coming in, it's key to, to reconciling growth and the environment. I mean, that's the second thing is that competition can be a very important driver of green innovation, provided you have consumers that are motivated one way or another to go green. So it's partly social preferences, but it's also, as Diane stressed and others stressed, complementary policies. So you have, and that's why you get to the triangle. You have the firms that innovate, but you can direct their innovation. You can direct their innovation through, of course, carbon tax. The carbon tax has to be fair, otherwise you get the yellow vest movement. It has, but also subsidy to green innovation in the smart industrial policy, and you have the civil society, consumers, shareholders that be thinking by Oliver Hart and Regis Ingales and others about that. So I think the triangle is a very operational thing. Competition entry is for sure unambiguously good. Competition can be good if combined appropriately, and that's why you need a mix of instruments, and you have to make sure that they don't that they don't go against each other, that these instruments playing jointly, and that's I think a key challenge, to make sure that the instruments that you use, be it industrial policy, competition policy, the carbon tariffs, the carbon tax, are all of them done right and combined right, and I think that's the way to go.
Thank you so much. Indeed, a challenge. Professor Coyle, you have the last word.
There's not much more to add to this very rich discussion. I think I'll just say that whatever they decide in a merger case or an abuse of dominance case, competition authorities are not just fixing markets, they're shaping markets now. And the way they do that isn't going to be neutral. It has to align with the societal goals and indeed global goals of decarbonisation.
Okay, thank you so much. On this note, I'd like to thank you all, like our excellent speakers, Professor Aghion, Professor Coyle, Professor Cheng, Dr. Romero. Thank you very much for this great discussion. It's been a pleasure to have you on the panel. We take now a short break, and we'll be back at 12:40 for another exciting discussion on competitive neutrality. Stay with us. Thank you.